Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the iron gates of a Victorian mental asylum, and trust me, you're not going to like what's waiting on the other side. Picture this. It's 1885, fog rolls through the streets of London, and you've just been declared unfit for society. Maybe you had a bad day and cried too much. Maybe you talked back to your husband. Maybe you just seemed a little too excitable at a dinner party. Whatever the reason, two men in dark coats have arrived at your door with paperwork, and now you're being dragged toward a massive Gothic building that looks like it was designed specifically to crush hope. The windows are barred. The walls are impossibly high. And that smell, that smell of unwashed bodies, carbolic acid, and something you can't quite identify but definitely don't want to, hits you the moment the heavy doors slam shut behind you. You probably won't survive this, and honestly, you might not want to. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing this community span the globe, from midnight in Melbourne to late evening in Los Angeles. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The carriage ride to the asylum felt like a descent into another world. You watched through the small window as familiar streets gave way to industrial outskirts, then to open fields, and finally to the isolated compound that would become your entire universe. Victorian society loved its asylums. By the 1890s, England alone housed over 100,000 people in these institutions. They were built far from city centers, supposedly to provide therapeutic country air, but really to keep the mad out of sight and out of mind. The building looming before you is one of dozens constructed during this era, each one grander and more prison-like than the last. Your feet crunch on gravel as you're led toward the entrance. The asylum is enormous, stretching in both directions with wings jutting out like the arms of some stone monster ready to embrace you. Gothic revival architecture was all the rage for these places. Pointed arches, crenellated towers, imposing facades that made you feel small and powerless before you even stepped inside. The Victorians believed that impressive buildings reflected impressive medical care. Spoiler alert, they were dead wrong. What they actually created were warehouses for human suffering, dressed up in fancy stonework and moral superiority. The attendant gripping your arm, a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained fingers and breath that could strip paint, doesn't speak to you. Why would he? You're not a person anymore. You're a patient, a case number, a problem to be managed. He pulls you through the main entrance into a cavernous hallway that echoes with distant sounds you can't quite place. Moaning, singing, screaming, all of the above. The floor is flagstone, worn smooth by thousands of shuffling feet before yours. Gas lamps flicker in wall sconces, creating shadows that seem to move on their own. Every surface is designed for easy cleaning: tile, stone, painted plaster, because apparently the architects knew there'd be a lot to clean. You're taken to the admission room, a sparse office with a desk, 2 chairs, and an examination table that's seen better decades. Behind the desk sits the admitting physician, a man in his 50s with impressive mutton chops and even more impressive self-regard. He doesn't look up from his paperwork when you enter. He's processed dozens of admissions this month alone. You're just another Wednesday. The attendant forces you into a chair. The wood is hard, uncomfortable, designed to prevent relaxation. And finally the doctor acknowledges your existence with a cursory glance. Name? He asks, pen poised. You tell him. He writes it down, misspelling it slightly. You don't bother to correct him because you're already learning the first rule of asylum survival. Your voice doesn't matter here. He asks your age, your occupation if you had one, your marital status. Each answer gets scratched onto the admission form in handwriting that looks like angry spiders died on the page. Then come the questions that will determine your fate. Do you hear voices? Do you have trouble sleeping? Have you experienced unusual excitability? Do you have improper thoughts? Here's the thing about Victorian psychiatric diagnosis: it was less science and more creative writing. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders wouldn't exist for another 70 years. Instead, doctors relied on vague categories like moral insanity, religious melancholy, masturbatory insanity, yes, really, and the ever-popular hysteria for women. Historians still argue whether Victorian psychiatrists genuinely believed in these diagnoses or simply used them as tools of social control, but either way, the results were the same. People got locked up for being inconvenient. The doctor examines you physically, though examine is generous. He checks your pulse, looks at your tongue, maybe listens to your heart if he's feeling thorough. Phrenology, the pseudoscience of reading personality from skull bumps, was still taken seriously in some circles, so he might run his fingers over your head, nodding sagely as if your cranial lumps are telling him secrets. They're not. It's nonsense. But it goes in your file anyway. Subject displays prominent development of the destructive organ, suggesting violent tendencies. You touched a bump. That's all you did. The room itself is cold. Asylums were always cold, inadequately heated despite Britain's damp climate. You can see your breath in the air. Your clothes, whatever you wore from home, will soon be taken from you. Personal belongings were generally confiscated upon admission, ostensibly for safekeeping but really to strip away your identity. You'd be given asylum clothing instead. Rough, shapeless garments made from the cheapest materials, identical to what every other patient wore. In here, you're not an individual. You're a category, a diagnosis, a case study. The doctor asks about your family history. Has anyone in your bloodline shown signs of madness, criminality, or degeneracy? The Victorians were obsessed with heredity, convinced that mental illness ran in families like bad china patterns. If your great-uncle once had a nervous breakdown, that's going in your file as evidence of inherited taint. If your sister is unmarried at 30, that's suspicious. If your father drinks, well, clearly you come from defective stock. The era's understanding of genetics was spectacularly wrong, but that didn't stop doctors from making confident pronouncements about your biological destiny. Then comes the question that seals your fate. What brings you to us? Maybe you don't know. Maybe you were brought here against your will by a husband tired of your opinions, or a father embarrassed by your behavior, or a parish official who didn't want to deal with your poverty. The Victorian mental health system made commitment shockingly easy. The 1890 Lunacy Act would eventually add some protections, requiring 2 medical certificates for involuntary admission, but loopholes abounded. A single justice of the peace could commit someone. A husband could commit a wife with minimal oversight. And once you were in, getting out was nearly impossible. The doctor makes notes. He writes in Latin, sometimes medical terminology designed to exclude you from understanding your own diagnosis. He might write melancholia, or mania, or dementia, without explaining what he means. These terms were used so loosely that they became almost meaningless. Depression, anxiety, epilepsy, postpartum psychosis, and simple nonconformity could all be labeled mania. Women who were too sexual got diagnosed with nymphomania. Women who weren't sexual enough got diagnosed with hysteria. Men who couldn't hold jobs were moral imbeciles. The diagnostic system was less about helping people and more about categorizing those who didn't fit society's narrow expectations. Your admission examination takes maybe 20 minutes. That's all the time needed to determine that you'll be spending months, years, possibly the rest of your life in this institution. No psychological testing, that field barely existed yet. No consideration of your life circumstances, your trauma, your rational reasons for distress. Just a quick assessment by a man who's already decided you're mad before you opened your mouth. Because sane people don't get brought to asylums, do they? It's circular logic at its finest. The attendant is summoned. The doctor hands him your file, already stamped, categorized, filed away, and you're pulled to your feet. Take this one to Ward C, the doctor says, already reaching for the next admission form. Ward C. You don't know what that means yet, but you'll learn. The asylum is divided into wards based on sex, class, and perceived level of disturbance. There are quiet wards for the harmless patients, noisy wards for the excited ones, and infirmary wards for the physically ill or dying. Where you end up depends on factors you can't control and judgments you can't appeal. As you're led deeper into the building, the sounds grow louder. Someone is singing the same line of a hymn over and over. Someone else is arguing with invisible companions. A woman's voice rises in a scream that cuts off abruptly. You don't want to think about why. The corridors are identical, designed in that Victorian institutional style where every hallway looks like every other hallway, making navigation impossible. This is intentional. Disorientation prevents escape attempts. You pass other patients shuffling along in their asylum uniforms, most with that telltale vacant stare that comes from months or years of medication, restraint, and routine. Some glance at you with curiosity. Fresh meat, new story, while others don't seem to register your presence at all. An old man stands facing a corner, rocking back and forth. A young woman sits on a bench, methodically pulling threads from her sleeve. These will be your neighbors, your dining companions, your entire social world. The attendant unlocks a door. Everything is locked, you're noticing, and ushers you into a large room lined with iron bedsteads. This is your ward, your new home. 30 or 40 beds packed close together, each with a thin mattress and threadbare blanket. No privacy curtains, no personal space, no dignity. A few patients lie in their beds staring at the ceiling. Others sit on the edges, rocking or muttering. One woman looks up at you with eyes that might have been kind once, before this place got to her. That one's yours. The attendant grunts, pointing to an empty bed near the back. You approach it slowly, taking in the stained mattress, the flat pillow, the scratches on the iron frame where previous occupants carved desperate marks. The window above offers a view of the asylum's inner courtyard, a bare space enclosed by high walls. No trees, no gardens, no beauty, just more stone and supervision. You sit on the bed. The mattress is stuffed with straw or horsehair, lumpy and uncomfortable. This is where you'll sleep tonight and tomorrow night, and every night until someone decides you're cured or you die trying. The reality settles over you like those thin blankets will later. You're trapped. The Victorian Mental Asylum operates on a simple principle. Once you're in, you stay in until the system is done with you. And the system is never in a hurry. Welcome to Bedlam. Well, not the actual Bethlehem Royal Hospital, that's just one asylum among hundreds, but the concept, the nightmare made real. You wouldn't last a day here, and you're about to spend a lot longer than that finding out why. The woman in the bed next to yours leans over, her breath sour, her eyes a little too wide. "What did they get you for?" she whispers. It's a question you'll hear a dozen times in your first week, because everyone here has a story, and most of those stories are infuriatingly mundane. You might have expected your fellow inmates to be genuinely dangerous, criminally insane, the stuff of penny dreadfuls and sensational newspaper reports. Instead, you're surrounded by women who cried too much after childbirth, men who couldn't hold down jobs during economic depressions, teenagers whose parents found them difficult, and elderly people whose families didn't want the burden of care. Before you can answer, an attendant rings a bell. It's time for something. You don't know what yet, but you'll learn that bells govern everything here. This particular bell means supper, and the patients around you begin shuffling toward the door with the resigned movements of people who've done this 1,000 times. You follow because what else are you going to do? The dining hall is another massive room. This one filled with long wooden tables and benches bolted to the floor. Bolted, because apparently someone once threw a bench, and the Victorian solution to violence was always restraint rather than addressing why someone might be driven to throw furniture. You're directed to a seat. A tin plate appears in front of you, delivered by a patient in a slightly better uniform. The asylum uses inmates for labor, you'll discover, a convenient arrangement that provides free workers while claiming to offer therapeutic occupation. On your plate sits what might charitably be called food. A grayish lump of some kind of meat, boiled potatoes that have achieved the texture of wet chalk, and a slice of bread that's more air than substance. No butter, no seasoning, no consideration for the fact that you're a human being who might enjoy a meal. The Victorian asylum diet was designed for cost efficiency, not nutrition or palatability. Most institutions operated on budgets of around 5 to 7 shillings per patient per week. That's roughly $30 to $40 in today's money, covering all food, clothing, heating, and care. You can imagine how far that stretches. Breakfast was typically bread and gruel. Lunch might offer a bit of meat if you were lucky. Supper was whatever they could boil into submission. Historians still debate whether the deliberate blandness was meant to be therapeutic. Some doctors genuinely believed that exciting foods caused mental agitation, or simply reflected the Victorian attitude that the mad didn't deserve pleasure. You force down a few bites because you're hungry, and you're learning that regular meals aren't guaranteed here. The potatoes taste like institutional despair seasoned with a hint of coal dust from the kitchen stove. Around you, patients eat in various states of engagement. Some shovel food mechanically, not tasting, just consuming. Others pick at their plates with the slow deliberation of people who have nothing but time. One man tries to eat with his hands before an attendant smacks them away and shoves a spoon at him. The attendants patrol the room, watching for infractions you don't yet know exist. After supper, which takes maybe 15 minutes because there's not enough food to warrant lingering, you're herded back to the ward. An attendant announces that it's quiet time, which you'll learn means sitting on your bed in silence until lights out. No books unless you're wealthy enough to have had family bring approved reading material. No conversation beyond whispers. No activities. Just sitting, staring, existing in the oppressive boredom that characterizes asylum life. The Victorians called this rest cure and genuinely believed that reducing stimulation helped the mentally ill. What it actually did was create a crushing tedium that could drive a sane person toward genuine madness. You lie on your bed, staring at the ceiling where water stains form abstract patterns. This is when your brain really begins processing what's happening. You're here. You're actually here. And nobody's coming to save you because the people who should advocate for you are the ones who put you here in the first place. The commitment process in Victorian England was shockingly casual for something so consequential. Your husband could have you committed simply by claiming you were unmanageable. Your father could commit you for moral insanity if you showed sexual interest or refused an arranged marriage. Parish authorities could commit poor people who became burdensome to local resources. The legal requirements were minimal. Before the 1890 Lunacy Act, a single medical certificate from any doctor would suffice. After 1890, 2 certificates were required, but doctors were easy to find if you had money or influence. Medical certificates often contained vague language, subject to delusions, violent tendencies, melancholic disposition. These phrases could mean almost anything. A woman who believed her husband was cheating, even if he actually was, could be labeled delusional. A man who expressed political opinions deemed extreme could show violent tendencies. Someone grieving a death could have a melancholic disposition. The diagnostic criteria were so broad that virtually anyone could be committed if someone wanted them gone. Class played an enormous role in how you were diagnosed and treated. If you came from a wealthy family, you might be diagnosed with something almost romantic, brain fever or nervous exhaustion, and sent to a private asylum with better food, private rooms, and gentle treatments. If you were poor, you got mania or idiocy, and wound up in a county asylum like this one, crowded in with dozens of others, surviving on gruel and neglect. The same behaviors that got you labeled eccentric if you were rich got you labeled insane if you were poor. The Victorian mental health system wasn't just bad medicine. It was class warfare dressed in medical terminology. Gender, too, shaped everything. Women could be committed for behaviors that were perfectly acceptable, even expected, in men. Postpartum depression, now recognized as a serious but treatable condition, was classified as puerperal insanity and often resulted in permanent institutionalization. Sexual desire in unmarried women was nymphomania. Anger or assertiveness was hysteria. One study of Victorian asylum records found that women were frequently admitted for overexertion, which apparently included reading too much, thinking too hard, or having opinions. Men, meanwhile, could be committed for unemployment, alcoholism, or moral degeneracy. But their admission rates were lower and their diagnoses less tied to simply being inconvenient. The patient in the next bed, the one who asked what they got you for, starts talking again. Her name is Margaret, she tells you, though the staff call her number 47, more often than not. She's been here 3 years. 3 years. The number hits you like a physical blow. She was admitted after her 4th child was born, crying uncontrollably, unable to cope. Instead of support, rest, or understanding, she got diagnosed with puerperal mania and shipped here. Her husband visits twice a year, she says, bringing no news of her children, offering no hope of release. He's remarried, She's heard, though divorce is nearly impossible, so she's legally still his wife. Just his wife who lives in an asylum. Margaret's story isn't unusual. You'll hear dozens like it. The woman 3 beds down was committed by her father after she refused to marry his business associate. The elderly man in the corner was brought here by his children who didn't want to care for him after a stroke left him confused. The young man near the window had epilepsy, which the Victorians often conflated with insanity. The middle-aged woman who rocks constantly was admitted for religious melancholy after her husband died, and she turned to the church for comfort. Apparently too much comfort, in someone's medical opinion. What becomes clear as you listen to these stories is that the Victorian asylum served multiple functions beyond treating mental illness. It was a dumping ground for inconvenient people, a repository for the poor and disabled, a tool of patriarchal control, and a convenient solution for families who didn't want to deal with difficult members. Some patients were genuinely mentally ill by any definition, suffering from schizophrenia, severe depression, or bipolar disorder. But many, perhaps most, were simply people who didn't fit Victorian society's rigid expectations of proper behavior. The diagnostic category of moral insanity deserves special attention because it perfectly encapsulates the Victorian approach to mental health. Coined by physician James Cowles Pritchard in 1835, moral insanity described people who showed no intellectual impairment but displayed morbid perversion of the natural feelings, affections, inclinations, temper, habits, moral dispositions, and natural impulses. In other words, people who felt or acted wrongly according to Victorian moral standards. This wasn't a medical diagnosis. It was a social judgment dressed in medical language. And it could get you locked up indefinitely. A bell rings again. You're learning to hate bells. And an attendant announces ablutions. You're herded with the other women into a washing room where cold water trickles from a few taps into a long trough. No privacy, no warm water, no time for modesty or dignity. You wash quickly, the cold making your fingers numb, trying not to make eye contact with the naked women around you. Victorian society was obsessed with propriety and shame around bodies, yet asylums stripped away every shred of privacy. The contradiction was apparently lost on administrators who saw patients as fundamentally different from normal people, less deserving of respect, less capable of shame, less human. After washing, you're given a nightgown, rough cotton that scratches and doesn't quite fit. Then it's back to the ward where gas lamps are being extinguished. The room falls into darkness broken only by moonlight through the barred windows. You lie on your lumpy mattress, pulling the thin blanket up, listening to the symphony of institutional night. Snoring, weeping, muttering, the creak of bed frames as people shift restlessly, the footsteps of attendants making rounds. Sleep doesn't come easily. Your mind races with questions. How long will you be here? What will happen to your home, your possessions, your life outside these walls? Will anyone advocate for your release? The answers aren't comforting. The average stay in a Victorian asylum was measured in years, not months. Some people entered in their 20s and died in their 60s, never having left. Release required either a miraculous recovery, rare, given that most treatments made people worse, or intervention by someone with authority and motivation to get you out. The certification process worked in reverse for discharge. Just as you needed medical certification to be admitted, you needed it to be released. But doctors were conservative about discharge, partly because they feared blame if released patients caused trouble, and partly because asylums were paid per patient. Empty beds meant reduced funding. Some private asylums were particularly notorious for keeping wealthy patients institutionalized indefinitely, milking families for fees. Even county asylums had incentives to maintain high populations to justify their budgets and staff. Your legal rights as a patient were nearly non-existent. You couldn't vote, sign contracts, or manage property. You couldn't demand to see your medical records or appeal your diagnosis. You couldn't refuse treatment, however barbaric. The 1890 Lunacy Act created the commissioners in lunacy, who were supposed to inspect asylums and investigate complaints, but their visits were infrequent and easily managed by administrators who knew when inspections were scheduled. Patients who complained to commissioners were often labeled as having delusions of persecution, because obviously, only a crazy person would claim they were being mistreated in an asylum. Some asylum doctors were genuinely trying to help, working within the limited understanding of their era. They believed in moral treatment, a philosophy that emphasized kindness, occupation, and routine over restraint and punishment. But moral treatment required resources, staff, space, activities, time, that most asylums didn't have. As populations swelled throughout the Victorian period, overcrowding made individualized care impossible. The kind doctor who might have spent time talking with patients in 1840 was overwhelmed by 1880, managing hundreds of patients with insufficient staff and funding. You think about the admission examination, how cursory it was, how little the doctor seemed to care about your actual experiences or symptoms. This wasn't unique to your case. Medical training in psychiatry was minimal in the Victorian era. Most asylum doctors, called alienists, learned on the job, picking up theories and practices from colleagues with no standardized curriculum or evidence base. Some held genuinely bizarre beliefs. That masturbation caused insanity, that tight corsets drove women mad, that reading novels overheated female brains. These weren't fringe theories. They appeared in medical journals and textbooks. The field of psychiatry itself was still defining its boundaries and legitimacy. Alienists wanted to be taken seriously as medical professionals, not merely custodians of the mad. This drove them to develop elaborate taxonomies of mental disorders, publish case studies, and propose treatments, however ineffective or harmful. The asylum became a laboratory where doctors could observe and experiment on captive populations. You, lying on this uncomfortable bed, are now part of that experiment whether you consented or not. A woman begins screaming several beds away. The sound is raw, desperate, the kind of scream that comes from somewhere beyond rational thought. Attendants rush in with a lamp, and you hear scuffling, harsh voices commanding silence, the metallic clink of restraints being applied. The screaming becomes muffled, then stops. The attendants leave. Silence returns, but it's different now, charged with tension, with the knowledge that any of you could be next if you disturbed the institutional peace. This is your first night. You have hundreds, maybe thousands more ahead of you. The diagnosis that got you here, whatever vague, subjective label they attached to your behavior, now defines your existence. You're no longer whoever you were before. You're a patient, a case, a problem to be managed. And tomorrow, the real horrors begin. The bell that jolts you awake comes at 5 in the morning, though you wouldn't know the time because you have no watch and the windows show only pre-dawn darkness. Around you, women groan and shift, pulling themselves from whatever restless sleep they managed to achieve. Your body aches from the terrible mattress, your neck stiff from the flat pillow, and you're already discovering that asylum life runs on a schedule so rigid it would make a military academy look relaxed. The attendant who rang the bell, a different woman from yesterday, equally grim, walks between the beds shouting, "Up, up, ablutions in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. You stumble out of bed with the others, your nightgown twisted around your legs, your mouth tasting like something died in it. There's a chamber pot under each bed because nighttime bathroom access isn't a thing here. Too much risk of escape attempts or incidents. And you're expected to empty it yourself during morning ablutions. The indignity of this hits you fresh, even though you knew chamber pots were standard in Victorian households. Somehow it feels different here, more degrading, part of the systematic stripping of adult autonomy. The washing room is even colder this morning, your breath visible as you splash icy water on your face. The shock of it wakes you fully, which is probably the point. A few women try to actually wash their hair, but the attendants rush them along. There's a schedule to keep, and your personal hygiene is low on the list of institutional priorities. You get maybe 3 minutes at the trough before you're pushed aside for the next group. No towels, so you drip dry or wipe your face on your nightgown. No toothbrushes unless your family brings them and they're approved. Your teeth will rot here, like everyone else's. Back to the ward to dress in your asylum uniform, which looks identical to everyone else's. A shapeless gray dress made from the cheapest cotton, thick stockings that sag at the ankles, heavy shoes that don't quite fit. The dress has no pockets, can't risk patients hiding things, and buttons up the back so you need help fastening it, another dependency built into the system. A woman you don't know buttons you up without speaking. You return the favor. This silent cooperation is one of the few kindnesses available in here. Another bell. Breakfast. You shuffle to the dining hall in a line, learning to keep pace with the group because stragglers get harsh words or worse from the attendants. The morning meal is placed before you. A bowl of gruel so thin you can see the bottom of the bowl through it, a small piece of bread, weak tea without sugar or milk. This is your fuel for the day. This is what the asylum considers adequate nutrition for human beings. You eat it because hunger is already gnawing at you, and you're learning that refusing food is a luxury you can't afford. The gruel tastes like boiled oats mixed with institutional despair and possibly some swept-up floor dust. Victorian asylum food was notoriously terrible, not just bland but often genuinely inadequate. Dietary science was primitive. Vitamins wouldn't be discovered until the early 1900s. So asylum administrators had no idea that scurvy, beriberi, and pellagra were caused by nutritional deficiencies. They just knew that patients got sick a lot and died at higher rates than the general population. Modern historians examining asylum records have found evidence of widespread malnutrition masquerading as symptoms of mental illness. Confusion, weakness, skin problems, all blamed on madness when they were really caused by vitamin deficiencies. After breakfast, the day's activities, and I use that term loosely, begin. For women, this typically means needlework, laundry, or cleaning. The Victorians believed in therapeutic occupation, the idea that keeping patients busy would improve their mental state. This wasn't entirely wrong. Purposeful activity can indeed help mental health, but asylum work was less therapeutic and more exploitative. You're not doing crafts for fun. You're doing institutional laundry that saves the asylum money. You're not learning valuable skills. You're scrubbing floors that will be dirty again tomorrow. You're assigned to the laundry today, which means hours in a hot, humid room filled with massive copper tubs and steam that makes breathing difficult. The laundry serves the entire asylum, hundreds of patients, dozens of staff, so there's always washing to do. You stand at a tub with 3 other women, scrubbing bedsheets against a washboard until your knuckles are raw. The water is scalding at first, gradually cooling to lukewarm as you work. The soap is harsh, caustic, stripping the oils from your skin. Your back begins to ache from bending over the tub. An attendant supervises, sitting in a chair near the door, occasionally shouting corrections. Harder. Those sheets aren't clean. She's not wrong. The sheets are stained with things you'd rather not identify, but no amount of scrubbing will get them truly clean. They'll go back on beds tonight, still dingy, smelling of carbolic and institutional funk. The woman next to you whispers that she's been doing laundry every day for 8 months. 8 months of standing at this tub, scrubbing sheets, breathing steam, working without pay or recognition or hope of promotion because this isn't employment. It's therapy. The asylum economy ran on patient labor. Estimates suggest that by the late Victorian period, up to 70% of asylum patients were engaged in some form of work. Men worked in the gardens, workshops, or farms that many asylums maintained. Women did domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, sewing, laundry. The most capable patients might be assigned as attendants to watch less capable patients, a hierarchy of exploitation that saved institutions enormous amounts on staffing costs. The work was justified as therapeutic, but the reality was that asylums couldn't function without free patient labor. Around 10 o'clock, you're guessing based on how long you've been working, a bell rings for morning exercise. You're herded out to the airing courts, the outdoor spaces where patients are allowed to walk in circles for exactly 30 minutes. The court is surrounded by high walls, eliminating any view except sky and stone. A few anemic shrubs struggle in one corner, their presence apparently constituting the therapeutic natural environment mentioned in asylum literature. Patients shuffle in circles, some talking to themselves, others silent, a few trying to actually walk for exercise though the space is too small for any real exertion. You notice that men and women are kept strictly separated, their airing courts on opposite sides of the complex. The Victorians were deeply anxious about sexuality, and asylums enforced rigid gender segregation to prevent moral contamination. The belief was that the mad were especially prone to sexual excess, another one of those convenient theories that justified control while revealing more about Victorian anxieties than about actual patient behavior. Historians still argue about whether this segregation was genuinely meant to protect patients or was simply another tool of social control, punishing and preventing the sexual expression of people already marginalized. The 30 minutes pass slowly. You walk because standing still draws attention from the attendants, but walking in circles is its own form of torture. Movement without progress, exercise without destination. Some women have claimed spots along the wall where they stand every day, their backs against the stone, staring at nothing. One young woman picks at the mortar between bricks with her fingernails, a pointless activity that's worn her nails to nothing. You wonder how long until you develop your own repetitive, meaningless ritual. Back inside. More work. If you're lucky, you might be assigned to something less physically demanding. Folding linens, sorting donations, picking oakum, unraveling old rope into fibers, a task borrowed from workhouses. If you're unlucky, it's more laundry or scrubbing floors, or working in the kitchens where the heat is unbearable and the risk of burns is constant. The work continues until midday dinner. Another bell, another shuffle to the dining hall. Today's dinner is boiled mutton that's more gristle than meat, turnips that have been boiled into submission, and more bread. You're starting to understand that bread is the foundation of the asylum diet, cheap, filling, nutritionally inadequate. The mutton is tough enough to require serious chewing, which is actually a blessing because it means the meal takes longer than breakfast. Time in here is strange. Working hours drag endlessly, but then meals and sleep periods flash by because they're the only relief from tedium. After dinner, it's back to work for another few hours. The routine is unvarying. Work, eat, work, exercise, work, eat, sleep, repeat. Sunday might offer chapel services instead of morning work, but even religious observance is regimented, controlled, stripped of any personal spiritual meaning. You sit in the chapel with hundreds of others, listening to a chaplain drone about salvation while attendants watch for any sign of religious excitement. Too much enthusiasm for God could get you labeled with religious mania and subjected to additional treatments. The monotony is deliberate. Victorian alienists believed that routine was therapeutic, that regularity would somehow normalize disordered minds. What it actually does is create a numbing sameness that erodes your sense of self. When every day is identical, when you have no choices about what to wear, eat, or do, when your entire existence is scheduled down to the minute, you start to lose track of who you are outside this routine. This is called institutionalization, and it happens faster than you'd think. Around 3 o'clock, you're getting better at estimating time by hunger and fatigue. There's afternoon tea. Tea is generous. It's hot water vaguely flavored with tea leaves that have been used too many times, plus another small piece of bread. You drink it because it's warm and wet, two qualities in short supply here. Some of the older patients have started saving their bread, hiding it in their clothing despite rules against hoarding food. You don't understand why until Margaret explains. Sometimes meals are withheld as punishment, and having hidden food might mean the difference between hunger and starvation. After tea, there's supposed to be recreation time, but recreation in a Victorian asylum is a sad affair. In the day room, you find a few battered books, religious texts mostly, with some Shakespeare and Dickens if you're lucky, but you have to share them among dozens of patients. There might be a piano, but only certain patients are allowed to play it, and only approved music. Cards and games are available, but attendants monitor them closely for signs of excitement or gambling. Mostly, recreation time means sitting on hard benches, staring at walls, waiting for the next bell. Some women do needlework during recreation, stitching samplers or mending clothing. This is considered especially therapeutic for female patients because it aligns with Victorian ideals of proper feminine behavior. Never mind that you've been scrubbing laundry for hours and your hands are cramped and raw. Sit quietly and sew. That's what good women do. The needlework produced by patients was sometimes sold, with profits going to the asylum rather than the women who made it. Therapeutic occupation. Remember, you're not workers deserving wages. You're patients receiving treatment. You attempt to read one of the books, a water-damaged Bible missing several pages, but concentration is difficult. The noise level in the day room is significant. Conversations, arguments, someone singing, another person laughing at nothing, the constant shuffle of feet and scrape of furniture. Privacy for quiet reading doesn't exist. Everything happens in groups under supervision with interruption. The Victorian asylum was designed around visibility and control, not comfort or individual needs. An attendant walks through, checking on patients, and you notice how the power dynamic works. Attendants were typically working-class people with no medical training, paid minimal wages to maintain order among populations that could be genuinely difficult. Many were decent people doing a hard job. Others were petty tyrants who enjoyed having power over vulnerable people. The problem is you can't tell which type you're dealing with until it's too late. And by then you've either gained an ally or made an enemy who controls your access to food, warmth, and basic dignity. Supper comes at 6. More bread, some cheese if you're lucky, weak tea. This is the last meal until breakfast tomorrow, 13 hours from now. Your stomach is already growling by the time you finish eating. The portion's too small for someone doing physical labor all day. Victorian nutrition science didn't account for the caloric needs of people scrubbing floors and washing laundry for hours. They just knew that feeding patients cost money, so portions stayed minimal. After supper, there's a brief period in the day room again. Then it's back to the ward for evening ablutions. Another quick, cold wash, and bed by 8 o'clock. Lights out at 9. You're exhausted from the physical labor and the emotional strain of constant supervision. But sleep is difficult on the terrible mattress, surrounded by sounds of distress, wondering how many more days like this you can endure. This is your routine now. This is every day. Wake at 5, wash in cold water, eat inadequate food, work until you're exhausted, walk in circles, eat again, work more, sleep poorly, repeat. No variation except which work assignment you get. No weekends off, no holidays, no breaks. Just the grinding routine of institutional life, designed to keep you occupied and docile, grinding away whatever individuality and spirit you had when you arrived. The most insidious part isn't the bad food or hard work or uncomfortable beds. It's how quickly you start to adapt. By your 3rd day, you're already falling into the routine without thinking. You wake at the bell, dress without being told, line up automatically. Your body learns the schedule even as your mind rebels against it. This is how institutionalization works. Repetition erodes resistance until compliance becomes automatic. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen ancient Egyptians supposedly used? The Victorian Asylum routine is about as scientifically sound and considerably less pleasant. At least crocodile dung was meant to help. This routine is meant to control, to occupy, to prevent trouble. Whether it actually helps anyone recover from mental illness is questionable at best. But it keeps the asylum running smoothly, and that's what really matters to the administrators counting pennies and avoiding scandals. You've been in the asylum for a week when they come for you with the treatment book. An attendant appears at the ward door during recreation time, scanning the room until her eyes land on you. Number 23, she calls. You've learned your number by now. Learn to respond to it like a trained animal. Come with me. Your stomach drops. You've heard whispers about treatments, seen women return from the medical wing looking dazed or bruised or fundamentally changed. Now it's your turn. The treatment room is in a separate wing, down corridors that grow progressively colder and more clinical. Medical instruments gleam on metal trays. Leather restraints hang from hooks on the wall like dormant snakes waiting to strike. The doctor from your admission examination is here, along with 2 burly attendants and a nurse in a starched uniform. The doctor consults his notes, your file, containing observations you've never seen and diagnoses you haven't been informed of. Persistent melancholia with hysterical features. He reads aloud, as if you're not in the room. We'll begin with hydrotherapy and purgatives. Hydrotherapy. The word sounds almost pleasant, like a spa treatment, until you learn what it actually means. The attendants strip you. No privacy, no dignity. Just rough hands pulling away your clothes until you're naked and shivering. They lead you to a bathtub, but this isn't the quick wash of morning ablutions. This is a treatment, which means it's designed to shock your system into submission. The water is ice cold, filled with chunks of actual ice, cold enough that when they force you in, your body convulses involuntarily. The shock is total. Your breath stops. Your heart hammers. Every nerve screams. The attendants hold you down. They know you'll try to escape this torture and keep you submerged up to your neck for what feels like hours but is probably 20 minutes. The theory behind cold water treatment was that it would calm the excited nerves and restore proper circulation to the brain. The reality is that it's just controlled torture dressed in medical language, a way to punish difficult patients while claiming therapeutic intent. Victorian alienists were absolutely obsessed with hydrotherapy in all its forms. Cold baths, hot baths, alternating baths, continuous baths where patients were kept in water for days or weeks, shower baths where high-pressure water was aimed at the head. Each variation had its supposed indication. Cold for mania, hot for melancholia, alternating for moral insanity. None of it worked. None of it was based on any real understanding of mental illness. But it was dramatic, it looked medical, and it gave doctors something active to do rather than admitting they had no idea how to actually help people. When they finally pull you from the ice bath, you're shaking so violently you can't stand. Your skin is blue-white, your lips purple, your fingers numb. They wrap you in rough towels and lead you to another room where a different torture awaits. The shower bath. This contraption directs a stream of cold water onto your head from several feet above. The pressure strong enough to feel like blows. The doctor believes this will stimulate the brain and drive out morbid thoughts. What it actually does is leave you dizzy, disoriented, and desperate for it to stop. After 15 minutes under the shower bath, water pounding your skull, streaming into your eyes and nose, making breathing difficult, you're released and sent to a narrow bed to rest and allow the treatment to take effect. You lie there wrapped in damp towels, still shaking, wondering what fresh horror comes next. The answer arrives in the form of a nurse carrying a tray of medicine bottles and a very large spoon. Purgatives. The Victorian medical establishment believed that mental illness was often caused by constipation, bad humors, or toxins in the digestive system. The solution: aggressive purging through laxatives, emetics, and enemas. The nurse forces a massive dose of calomel down your throat. Mercury chloride, toxic and violent in its effects, followed by castor oil to speed the evacuation. You're going to spend the next several hours in intestinal agony, running to the water closet until there's nothing left to expel and then continuing anyway. The mercury in calomel is genuinely poisonous. Victorian doctors didn't know this or didn't care because they could see that it produced dramatic effects and assumed effects meant efficacy. Patients given regular calomel treatments developed mercury poisoning, tremors, tooth loss, kidney damage, neurological problems. These symptoms were often interpreted as signs of worsening mental illness rather than iatrogenic harm caused by the treatment itself. Historians examining Victorian asylum records have found cases where patients were literally poisoned to death by their treatments, their deaths attributed to their original mental conditions rather than medical malpractice. Over the next few weeks, you experience the full repertoire of Victorian psychiatric treatment. There's bloodletting because, of course, there is. The ancient practice of draining blood to balance the humors was still in use in some asylums well into the 1880s. A doctor makes small cuts on your arm and collects blood in a bowl, weakening you further while claiming it will relieve cerebral congestion. You're already malnourished from the terrible asylum diet. Losing blood on top of that leaves you faint and exhausted. Then comes the blistering, a treatment so barbaric it's hard to believe medical professionals endorsed it. The doctor applies a caustic substance, usually cantharides, derived from blister beetles, to patches of your skin, deliberately creating painful blisters. The theory was that drawing inflammation to the surface would relieve internal inflammation of the brain. The reality was burns, infection risk, and excruciating pain. You develop blisters on your neck and behind your ears, weeping sores that take weeks to heal, leaving scars you'll carry forever. For patients diagnosed with mania or excitement, treatments were even more aggressive. The rotating chair was a favorite. Patients were strapped into a chair suspended from the ceiling and spun rapidly until they vomited, lost consciousness, or both. The centrifugal force was supposed to redistribute blood flow to the brain. It actually caused severe nausea, disorientation, and terror. You witness another patient undergo this treatment, watching as she's spun until she passes out, then revived and spun again because the doctor didn't observe sufficient therapeutic response the first time. The restraint chair is another innovation, though calling it innovative is generous. It's exactly what it sounds like: a wooden chair with leather straps for ankles, wrists, chest, and head, rendering the occupant completely immobile. Patients could be kept in restraint chairs for hours or days as punishment for violent behavior, suicide attempts, or simply being inconvenient. You see a man in one during your trip to the medical wing, his head held rigidly forward by a strap across his forehead, drool running down his chin because he can't move enough to swallow properly. He's been there for 3 days, an attendant mentions casually, for throwing his breakfast tray. Straitjackets are everywhere, standard equipment for managing difficult patients. The canvas jacket wraps around your torso with sleeves that extend far beyond your hands, crossing over your chest and buckling in back where you can't reach. Once you're in a straitjacket, you're helpless. Can't eat, can't scratch an itch, can't protect yourself if you fall. Patients were kept in straitjackets for days, developing sores where the canvas rubbed, muscle atrophy from immobility, and profound psychological trauma from the helplessness. Mechanical restraints were considered more humane than chemical ones, bizarrely. The alternative to the straitjacket was heavy sedation with drugs that were poorly understood and dangerously administered. Chloral hydrate was a favorite sedative, given in doses that would horrify modern pharmacologists. Patients were also given bromides, morphine, opium, and later paraldehyde, all addictive, all with serious side effects, all administered with minimal monitoring or concern for dependency. You're given bromide salts mixed with water, a foul-tasting concoction that's supposed to calm your nerves. What it actually does is make you sluggish, confused, and eventually causes bromism, a toxic buildup that produces acne, hallucinations, and psychosis. Victorian doctors couldn't distinguish between symptoms of mental illness and symptoms of bromide poisoning. So patients exhibiting signs of bromism were often given more bromide to treat their worsening condition. It's circular insanity at its finest. Some treatments border on the experimental, because Victorian asylums were laboratories where doctors could try anything on captive populations. Galvanism, applying electrical current to the body, was popular in some institutions. Doctors would attach electrodes to your head or body and run electricity through you, causing muscles to contract violently. This was supposed to stimulate sluggish nerves or disrupt morbid thought patterns. It was essentially primitive electroshock therapy without any of the modern refinements that make ECT somewhat safer and occasionally effective. The diet cure was another experiment. Some doctors believed that certain mental conditions could be cured by radical dietary changes. This might mean being put on a milk-only diet for weeks, or forced to eat nothing but vegetables, or given massive amounts of meat in the belief that brain workers need protein. These dietary experiments often caused more problems than they solved: nutritional imbalances, digestive issues, metabolic problems, but they looked scientific and gave doctors something to publish papers about. Cranial measurements and phrenological examinations continue throughout your stay. Doctors periodically measure your skull with calipers, noting the dimensions in your file as if the circumference of your head reveals anything about your mental state. They palpate your scalp, identifying bumps and depressions. They correlate with personality traits and mental faculties. Overdeveloped organ of combativeness. One writes after finding a slight prominence behind your ear, "You didn't fight anyone. You have a normal skull, but now your file contains evidence of violent tendencies based on a bump." The insulin shock therapy that would become infamous in the 20th century hasn't been invented yet, but Victorian doctors had their own version. Deliberate induced hypoglycemia through starvation or excessive purgation. The resulting weakness, confusion, and altered consciousness were interpreted as the illness breaking, rather than as signs of dangerous metabolic disturbance. Patients in hypoglycemic crisis were sometimes tied down because their convulsions and confusion looked like fits of madness. Restraint beds, called cribs, are used for patients deemed especially dangerous or suicidal. These are literally cage-like structures you're locked into at night, wooden slats on all sides preventing any movement beyond lying flat. Imagine being in a coffin-sized box for 12 hours every night, unable to turn over, unable to sit up if you feel nauseated, unable to escape if the building catches fire. This was considered humane compared to older methods like chaining patients to walls. For female patients diagnosed with hysteria, and remember that diagnosis covered everything from anxiety to assertiveness, special treatments were reserved. Uterine massage, pelvic douching with various temperature waters, application of leeches to the genitals, all based on the theory that hysteria originated in the womb. The Greek word hystra means uterus. These treatments were invasive, humiliating, and completely ineffective, but they persisted because they aligned with Victorian beliefs about female biology and psychology. The rest cure, developed by neurologist Silas Ware Mitchell, was sometimes employed for female patients with neurasthenia. This involved complete bed rest for weeks or months, isolation from family and friends, a milk-based diet, and sometimes forced feeding. Patients were forbidden to read, write, or engage in any intellectual activity. The goal was to build up physical health while suppressing mental activity, based on Mitchell's belief that women's brains couldn't handle the stress of thinking too much. The treatment often caused exactly the mental deterioration it claimed to prevent. Male patients had their own special horrors, particularly those diagnosed with masturbatory insanity. Victorian medicine was convinced that masturbation caused everything from acne to actual insanity, and treatments ranged from the ridiculous to the barbaric. Patients might have their hands tied at night, be fitted with spiked anti-masturbation devices, or in extreme cases undergo circumcision without anesthesia as both treatment and punishment. The medical literature on this is extensive and uniformly horrifying. Trephination, drilling holes in the skull, was mostly abandoned by the Victorian period, but some asylums still practiced it for cases of severe brain congestion. The theory was that releasing built-up pressure would relieve symptoms. The reality was infection, brain damage, and often death. Even in institutions that didn't practice actual trepanation, the threat of it was sometimes used to ensure compliance from difficult patients. You undergo treatments several times a week, sometimes daily. Cold baths on Monday, purgatives on Tuesday, bloodletting on Thursday. Each one leaves you weaker, more confused, less able to advocate for yourself. This is partly intentional, compliant patients are easier to manage, and partly just the natural result of subjecting malnourished people to physical trauma repeatedly. You start to understand why so many long-term patients have that vacant look. They've been treated into submission. The worst part isn't the physical pain, though that's substantial. It's the psychological warfare of being told these tortures are for your own good, that your resistance proves you're sick, that if you just submit and improve, they'll stop. But there's no clear endpoint, no criteria for success. You can't cure a diagnosis that was never based on objective symptoms. You can't prove you're sane when your rational objections are interpreted as evidence of delusion. Some patients do report feeling better after certain treatments, but historians still argue whether this was genuine therapeutic effect, placebo response, or just relief that the treatment was over. The human mind is remarkably good at finding meaning and benefit even in harmful experiences, especially when the alternative is admitting you're being tortured with no purpose. Your body bears the marks now. Scars from blistering, bruises from restraints, the pallor of repeated bloodletting, the tremor in your hands from bromide toxicity. You're becoming a walking catalog of Victorian medical hubris, each treatment leaving its signature on your flesh while claiming to heal your mind. The building itself is your enemy, you're beginning to realize. Every architectural choice, every design element, every spatial decision was made with control in mind rather than comfort or healing. The Victorian Asylum wasn't just a hospital. It was a carefully engineered machine for managing large populations of unwanted people, and you're learning how efficiently it operates. Take the layout, for instance. Most asylums were built on the corridor plan, with a central administrative block and long wings radiating outward. This design maximized surveillance. Staff in the center could monitor multiple wings, while minimizing patient autonomy. The corridors themselves are weapons of control. They're long, straight, and monotonous, deliberately designed to disorient and discourage escape attempts. You walk down one corridor and it looks exactly like every other corridor. Same tile floors worn smooth by shuffling feet, same painted plaster walls in institutional green or beige, same gas lamps at regular intervals, same locked doors every 20 feet. After a few weeks, you still get lost trying to navigate from your ward to the dining hall. This isn't accidental clumsiness on your part. It's intentional design meant to keep you dependent on staff for basic navigation. The doors are everywhere, and they're all locked. Heavy wooden doors with iron reinforcement, each requiring a key from the enormous ring that attendants carry on their belts. The sound of those keys jangling becomes the soundtrack of your life here, a constant reminder that you cannot move freely, cannot access spaces without permission, cannot leave. Some doors have small windows at eye level so staff can observe patients without entering. You learn quickly that these windows mean you're never truly alone, never truly unwatched. Windows in patient areas are barred, of course, heavy iron bars set into stone frames. But it's not just the bars, the windows themselves are positioned too high to easily look out of, or they face inward toward courtyards rather than outward to the world beyond. This serves dual purposes. It prevents escape attempts and, more insidiously, it cuts you off from visual connection to normal life. You can't see the street, can't watch people going about their business, can't remind yourself that a world exists beyond these walls. Some asylums used frosted or textured glass in patient areas, further limiting the view even through barred windows. The ceilings are high 12, 15 feet in some rooms, which sounds grand until you realize it's about acoustics and air circulation rather than aesthetics. High ceilings mean sounds echo and carry, so staff can hear disturbances from greater distances. It also means heat rises away from patients in winter, keeping rooms perpetually cold despite whatever minimal heating exists. You're always cold here, always wrapping your thin shawl tighter, always seeking the few warm spots near radiators where patients cluster like moths around flames. The day rooms are particularly fascinating examples of architectural control. These large common spaces have furniture bolted to the floor, heavy wooden benches and tables that can't be moved, can't be thrown, can't be rearranged to create privacy or comfort. The arrangement is always the same. Benches along walls, facing inward so staff can see everyone's faces, spaced far enough apart that patients can't easily pass objects between them. Some day rooms have platforms or stages at one end where staff can observe the entire room, a panopticon arrangement that ensures constant visibility. The sleeping wards follow similar principles. Beds arranged in neat rows, all facing the same direction, spaced close enough to maximize capacity but far enough apart that you can't reach the next bed without getting up. An attendant's desk sits at one end, positioned to survey the entire room. In some wards, a night light burns perpetually, casting just enough illumination that attendants can see movement without providing enough light for patients to read or do anything productive. Sleep becomes another controlled activity, happening under observation on schedule without privacy. Bathrooms, or water closets, as the Victorians called them, are designed for efficiency and supervision rather than dignity. A row of toilets without stalls or partitions, sometimes just holes in a long wooden bench positioned over a trough. You perform your bodily functions in full view of anyone else in the room, plus any staff member who might walk in. Privacy wasn't considered a patient right. It was a privilege that could be revoked, and in asylums it was revoked by default. The message was clear. Your body is not your own, your dignity is not protected, your shame is irrelevant. The segregation of the asylum into different wards creates its own architectural hierarchy. The quiet wards for chronic, harmless patients might have slightly better conditions. Smaller rooms, a bit more furniture, occasionally a rug or curtain. The refractory wards for difficult or violent patients are deliberately austere. Bare walls, minimal furniture, maximum restraint options built into the architecture itself. You see one of these cells during a transfer through the building. Padded walls that look almost soft until you realize they're there so patients can be left to throw themselves against walls without causing visible injury. Seclusion rooms represent the ultimate architectural expression of control. These are small cells, maybe 8 by 10 feet, containing nothing but a mattress on the floor and a bucket for waste. The door is solid wood or iron with only a small observation slot. Patients can be locked in these rooms for hours, days, or weeks as punishment or therapeutic isolation. The darkness is nearly complete. Maybe a small barred window near the ceiling admits some light. Maybe not. The silence is oppressive, broken only by your own breathing and the sounds of your own mind turning against you. Historians still debate whether seclusion was genuinely meant as treatment or was simply punishment by another name. Victorian alienists wrote extensively about the therapeutic benefits of isolation. Removing stimulation, preventing the patient from disturbing others, forcing introspection and self-control. But the descriptions from patients who experienced it tell a different story. Terror, disorientation, hallucinations brought on by sensory deprivation, psychological damage that persisted long after release from the cell. The asylum grounds, when you're allowed outside, reveal more architectural control. High walls surround the entire complex, 15, 20 feet tall, topped with iron spikes or broken glass embedded in mortar. These aren't decorative garden walls. They're barriers designed to keep patients in and the world out. Gates are few, always locked, always guarded. The message is inescapable. This is a prison that calls itself a hospital. The airing courts you're allowed into are deliberately featureless. Some asylums made token efforts at landscaping, a few shrubs, maybe a tree, but most are just bare yards with gravel or dirt surfaces. No benches to rest on, no shade to escape the sun, no interesting features to occupy your attention. You walk in circles because there's nothing else to do, nothing to look at, nowhere to go. The monotony of the architecture extends even to outdoor spaces, ensuring that escape from the building doesn't mean escape from institutional control. Water features appear in some asylum grounds, but not for decoration. These are cold plunge pools for hydrotherapy, or sometimes just drainage ditches for the primitive sewage systems. The Victorians loved water treatments, remember, so some asylums had elaborate bathing facilities in outbuildings. Rooms with multiple tubs, shower apparatus, even early versions of wet packs where patients were wrapped in cold, wet sheets for hours. The architecture of these spaces is clinical, tile-covered, designed for easy cleaning of bodily fluids and easy restraint of struggling patients. The administrative wing, which you glimpse during trips to the medical offices, is tellingly different from patient areas. Here there are carpets, curtains, comfortable furniture, decorative elements. The offices where doctors work have windows with actual views, wallpaper instead of painted plaster, fireplaces that function. The architectural message is clear. This comfort is for staff, not patients. You are different kinds of people deserving different kinds of spaces. Some asylums included chapels, built in Gothic Revival style to match the main building's intimidating architecture. These spaces were meant to be uplifting, to provide spiritual comfort and moral instruction. But even here, design choices prioritized control. Separate sections for male and female patients, benches instead of pews so nothing could be moved, elevated pulpits that position clergy above and separate from the congregation, locks on the hymnal cabinets so patients couldn't access books unsupervised. The kitchens and work areas reveal the industrial scale of asylum operations. Massive copper kettles for boiling institutional quantities of food, long tables for food preparation, storage rooms that could stock provisions for hundreds. The architecture here is purely functional. Stone floors for easy cleaning, high windows for ventilation, separate areas for different tasks. Patients who work in these spaces, and remember, most able-bodied patients do work, navigate an environment designed for efficiency rather than safety or comfort. Heating systems in Victorian asylums were notoriously inadequate. Some had radiators or steam heat in common areas, but patient sleeping wards were often minimally heated or not heated at all. The theory was that cold air was healthy, that overheating led to excitement and agitation. The reality was that patients suffered through British winters in unheated rooms, piling on whatever thin blankets they had, developing chilblains and respiratory infections. The architecture provided no protection from cold because protecting patient comfort wasn't a design priority. Ventilation was another architectural concern, though not for patient benefit. The Victorians believed in miasma theory, that diseases spread through bad air, so asylums incorporated ventilation systems to move air through buildings. But these systems often created drafts that made cold rooms colder, and they didn't actually prevent the spread of the tuberculosis, pneumonia, and other infectious diseases that ravaged asylum populations. The architecture looked scientifically advanced while failing to protect patient health. The sick wards, where physically ill patients were isolated, show the overlap between asylum and hospital architecture. These are wards with more beds packed closer together, basic medical equipment, and the same lack of privacy as everywhere else. When you develop a fever from one of your treatments or catch an infection from the unsanitary conditions, this is where you'll be sent, not to recover in peace but to be sick under observation, your illness becoming another data point in the institutional record. Some asylums had workshops where patients performed skilled labor, carpentry, shoemaking, tailoring. The architecture of these spaces mimicked factory design. Long rooms with workbenches, tool storage, supervising staff position to observe all workers. The products made here, furniture, clothing, goods for asylum use or sale, represented thousands of hours of unpaid patient labor, justified by claiming that work was therapeutic and that patients should contribute to their own maintenance costs. The morgue exists in every asylum, usually in a basement or separate building. You don't want to think about it, but it's there. A cold room with metal tables where bodies are prepared for burial or dissection. Victorian asylums had high mortality rates. Some studies suggest nearly 10% annual death rates in chronic wards, so morgue facilities were essential infrastructure. The architecture here is coldly practical. Tile walls, drains in the floor, storage for coffins, and in some cases, dissection equipment because asylum doctors sometimes performed autopsies to study the brains of their deceased patients. The administrative records rooms contain files on every patient who's passed through the institution. Admission papers, medical notes, correspondence, discharge, or death certificates. These rooms are locked, of course, their contents inaccessible to the patients whose lives they document. The architecture protects the institution's records more carefully than it protects the institution's patients, ensuring that whatever happens within these walls is documented for legal protection while remaining hidden from outside scrutiny. Walking through the asylum, moving between your ward and the dining hall and the work areas and the airing courts, you're constantly reminded that every space has been designed to diminish you. Low doorways in some areas force you to bow your head. Narrow corridors make you walk single file. Locked doors make you wait for permission. The architecture doesn't just house you. It shapes you, trains you, breaks you down into a compliant institutional subject who knows her place in the hierarchy of control. The building is aging around you, too. These massive Victorian institutions were built quickly and cheaply despite their impressive facades. Plaster cracks, revealing the rough brick beneath. Paint peels in long strips. Floors develop uneven spots where thousands of feet have worn grooves. The decay is visible everywhere, a physical manifestation of the institutional neglect that characterizes asylum life. Money that should go to maintenance goes instead to expanding capacity, always more patients, always less funding per person. You realize that you could spend years learning the geography of this place and still discover new corridors. Locked wards you've never accessed, spaces whose purposes you can only guess at. The asylum is vast, labyrinthine, designed to be incomprehensible to its inmates. And that's the point. The architecture of control works best when those being controlled can't fully understand the system they're trapped within. Margaret, remember her, the woman in the next bed who asked what they got you for, isn't the only person whose story reveals the true function of Victorian asylums. As weeks pass, you meet dozens of fellow inmates, and their stories form a devastating pattern. The elderly woman who shuffles past your bed each morning mumbling to herself? That's Mrs. Harrison, admitted at 65 when her son decided caring for her was inconvenient. She had a stroke that left her confused and occasionally incontinent, conditions that warranted family support, not institutionalization. But here she is, 3 years later, her confusion now compounded by institutional life and bromide treatments that have turned temporary disability into permanent decline. The young man you see in the airing courts, always standing alone near the wall? Thomas, 22, epileptic. Victorian society couldn't distinguish between epilepsy and insanity, so seizure disorders often landed people in asylums. Thomas isn't mentally ill by any modern definition. He has a neurological condition that causes occasional seizures, but because these seizures frighten people and disrupt households, he's been locked away. The asylum's treatments, particularly the heavy sedation meant to prevent seizures, have left him sluggish and withdrawn. He was animated and intelligent when he arrived, another patient tells you. 2 years of treatment have reduced him to the hollow-eyed ghost you see now. Then there's Sarah, a girl of 17 in your ward, admitted for what her file calls moral insanity. Her crime? Getting pregnant out of wedlock. Victorian morality couldn't tolerate unmarried motherhood, so Sarah was declared insane and committed, her baby taken away at birth and given to an orphanage or adoptive family. She doesn't know which. She's been here 6 months, and there's no discussion of discharge because moral insanity has no cure. She'll likely remain institutionalized for years, perhaps forever, not because she's mentally ill but because she violated sexual norms. The class dynamics are impossible to ignore. The asylum contains a cross-section of poverty. Domestic servants dismissed for nervous disorders that were probably just exhaustion and stress. Laborers whose industrial accidents left them with head injuries and personality changes. Seamstresses and laundry workers who developed hysteria from overwork and malnutrition. The wealthy mentally ill go to private asylums with better food and private rooms. The poor mentally ill come here, warehoused 50 to a ward, given the cheapest possible care. You meet Catherine, a former governess in her 30s, articulate and observant despite her diagnosis of religious melancholy. She explains the asylum's class system to you one evening during recreation time. The pauper lunatics, she says, keeping her voice low so attendants don't hear. We're the majority here, admitted by parish authorities who don't want to support us in workhouses. We cost the government about 5 shillings a week to maintain. The private patients in the better wings pay £5 to £10 weekly, sometimes more. Same building, different worlds. Catherine's story is particularly tragic. She was a well-educated woman working in a respectable household when her employer died. Grief-stricken and suddenly unemployed, she turned to religion for comfort, attending services daily, praying frequently. Her new employer found this excessive and inconvenient, so he had her evaluated by a doctor friend who diagnosed religious melancholy. That was 8 years ago. 8 years of institutional life have indeed made her melancholic, but not in the way the diagnosis suggested. There's a whole category of patients who are here because they were inconvenient to someone with power over them. Wives committed by husbands for being disobedient or unfaithful or simply difficult. One woman, Elizabeth, was committed by her husband after she discovered his affair and confronted him publicly. He declared her hysterical and paranoid, got 2 compliant doctors to sign certificates, and had her institutionalized. The affair that triggered her madness? Documented in letters other patients have heard about through the staff gossip network. But her husband's adultery doesn't matter. Her reaction to it is what got pathologized. The men's wards hold similar stories. You hear about them through the institutional grapevine, the whispered network of patient communication that forms despite gender segregation. There's a man who was a political radical, advocating for workers' rights, declared insane for his dangerous ideas. Another who inherited property his relatives wanted, conveniently diagnosed as incompetent and committed, leaving his estate in their control. Victorian commitment laws created obvious opportunities for abuse, and unscrupulous families took advantage. Children are here too, which might be the most heartbreaking discovery. The asylum has a separate ward for juveniles, boys and girls as young as 10 or 12, committed for imbecility, moral deficiency, or uncontrollable behavior. Some are genuinely developmentally disabled, needing education and support they're not receiving here. Others are just difficult children whose parents or workhouse officials found them unmanageable. They're growing up in this institution, learning institutional life as their normal, their childhood stolen by diagnoses that were often just adult inability to cope with youthful energy or trauma. You meet one of these children during a rare interaction when wards mix for a special chapel service. Her name is Annie, 14, here for 3 years since her mother died and her father remarried. The new stepmother declared her defective and had her committed. Annie seems perfectly normal when you talk to her, sad, certainly traumatized by institutionalization, but not intellectually disabled or mentally ill. She's simply unwanted, and the asylum provides a convenient dumping ground for unwanted children. The immigrant population in the asylum reflects Victorian xenophobia and cultural misunderstanding. There's an Italian man whose animated communication style was interpreted as mania. An Irish woman whose accent and Catholic faith made her suspect. Her grief over separation from her family reframed as melancholia requiring treatment. Historians examining Victorian asylum records have found that immigrants were disproportionately likely to be institutionalized and less likely to be discharged, partly due to language barriers but mostly due to cultural prejudice masquerading as medical diagnosis. Then there are the genuinely mentally ill patients, the ones who would meet modern diagnostic criteria for serious conditions like schizophrenia, severe depression, or bipolar disorder. These patients desperately need help, but they're getting the same ineffective or harmful treatments as everyone else. You watch a woman experiencing what's probably schizophrenia, hearing voices, responding to hallucinations, being subjected to ice baths and restraints that do nothing to address her underlying condition. Without antipsychotic medications, which won't be developed for another 70 years, she cycles through acute episodes and quieter periods, her entire life contained within asylum walls because Victorian medicine has no real treatment to offer. The chronic wards house long-term patients who've been institutionalized for decades. These are the people the system has completely broken. Institutionalized so long they can't remember life outside, so adapted to routine that freedom would be terrifying. You see them during your work assignments, elderly people shuffling through their days, following commands without thought, their personalities eroded by years of submission and medication. Some were admitted young and grew old here. Others arrived middle-aged and declined into confused senescence under institutional care. There's a particularly disturbing category of patient, the moral imbeciles, usually women, whose only real pathology was sexual behavior that Victorian society found unacceptable. Prostitutes were sometimes committed as morally insane. Women who had multiple sexual partners, who showed sexual desire too openly, who violated the period's rigid sexual codes. All could be diagnosed with moral insanity and locked away indefinitely. The diagnosis was explicitly about morality, not mental health, but it carried the same consequence: indefinite institutionalization with no clear path to release. You discover that some patients are actually quite intelligent and insightful about their situations. James, a man you meet during a mixed-gender chapel service, was a clerk before his admission. He's educated, articulate, and has spent his 5 years in the asylum observing and analyzing the system. "We're a social solution," he tells you quietly during the hymn singing when attendants aren't listening closely. "Not a medical population. Look around. How many people here are actually mad? And how many are just unwanted?" His observation is uncomfortably accurate. The asylum contains the full range of people Victorian society didn't want to deal with. The mentally ill, certainly, but also the elderly, the disabled, the poor, the sexually non-conforming, the politically inconvenient, the simply difficult. The medical diagnosis provides a veneer of scientific legitimacy to what is essentially social control. Once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. The patients who arrived genuinely mentally ill often deteriorate under asylum care. The lack of effective treatment, the terrible conditions, the isolation from family and normal life, the traumatic treatments, all contribute to worsening outcomes. A woman admitted with mild depression becomes severely depressed after months of institutional life. A man with anxiety develops paranoia after experiencing asylum treatments. The institution that claims to heal is actually harming, creating chronic patients out of people who might have recovered with proper support. Some patients have been here so long that they have no family left outside. Parents have died, siblings have moved away, spouses have remarried or disappeared. These patients are truly trapped. Even if they were deemed recovered, they have nowhere to go and no one to discharge them to. The Victorian social safety net was minimal, and asylum patients fell through what gaps existed. Without family support, your options after asylum were limited to workhouse, homelessness, or staying institutionalized. You learn about the patient hierarchy, the informal social structure within the ward. Long-term patients have higher status and more privileges. First choice of the better beds, occasional extra food, more lenient treatment from familiar attendants. New patients like you are bottom of the hierarchy, subject to hazing, manipulation, and theft by more established inmates. Someone steals your hidden piece of bread one night. You never find out who, but you learn to sleep lightly and guard what little you have. There are also patient trustees, inmates given special responsibilities in exchange for small privileges. These trustees might supervise other patients during work, distribute meals, report infractions to staff. It's a brilliant system of control, using patients to police each other, creating divisions and competition that prevent solidarity. Some trustees are genuinely trying to make the best of a bad situation. Others abuse their small power, taking out their frustrations on more vulnerable patients. The sexual dynamics in a gender-segregated institution create their own problems. Homosexual relationships develop, which Victorian authorities find deeply disturbing and try to prevent through surveillance and punishment. But you also hear whispered stories of staff taking advantage of patients, attendants who assault vulnerable women, doctors who abuse their authority. These stories are never officially acknowledged, and victims who complain are labeled as having sexual delusions, their testimony dismissed as symptoms of their madness. You witness the crushing effect of hopelessness on your fellow patients. People who arrived fighting for release gradually give up as months become years. They stop writing letters begging family to retrieve them. They stop insisting they're sane. They stop asking when they can leave. They adapt to institutional life because adaptation is the only survival strategy available. And in adapting, they become exactly what the diagnosis claimed: different, separate, unable to function in normal society. Not because they were inherently mad, but because the institution has made them so. The community among patients is complex. There's genuine kindness. Margaret sharing her hidden bread when you're sick, Catherine teaching you which attendants to avoid, older patients warning newcomers about dangerous treatments. But there's also cruelty born of desperation. Theft, betrayal to staff for favors, bullying to feel some sense of power in a powerless situation. The asylum brings out both the best and worst in people, and you see both daily. The attendant who wakes you each morning is named Mrs. Pritchard, a heavy woman in her 40s with perpetually cold hands and a voice that could strip paint. She's been working here for 12 years, earning about £20 annually, roughly what a housemaid makes, except housemaids don't have to manage potentially violent mentally ill patients. Mrs. Pritchard has no medical training, no psychiatric education, no qualifications beyond being physically strong enough to restrain patients and desperate enough to take a job most people avoid. This is your primary caregiver. This is the person who decides whether you get an extra blanket when you're cold, whether your complaints of illness are real or manipulative, whether your behavior warrants punishment or tolerance. The attendant staff forms the backbone of asylum operations, and they're universally overworked and underpaid. Ratios of one attendant to 30 or 40 patients aren't unusual. During night shifts, a single attendant might be responsible for an entire ward of 50 people. This isn't because Victorian asylum administrators believed in patient independence. It's because hiring adequate staff costs money, and asylums operated on brutally tight budgets. The result is that attendants develop shortcuts and harsh methods for maintaining control over populations they can't adequately supervise. Mrs. Pritchard isn't particularly cruel by asylum standards, which tells you how low those standards are. She doesn't hit patients without provocation, doesn't withhold food for personal amusement, doesn't sexually abuse her charges. All things that do happen with less scrupulous attendants. But she's not kind either. She's tired, frustrated, dealing with impossible working conditions, and she takes it out on the easiest targets: the patients who can't fight back. When you're too slow getting out of bed, she yanks the blanket away roughly. When you ask a question, she ignores you. When another patient cries, she tells her to shut up or face seclusion. The male attendants on the men's wards have a reputation for violence. You hear stories from patients who've witnessed incidents. Attendants punching patients who resist restraint, kicking men who move too slowly, twisting arms during escorts to treatment rooms. Some of this violence is officially sanctioned. Physical force was considered appropriate for controlling violent patients, but much of it crosses into abuse. The problem is that patient testimony isn't credible in Victorian legal systems. Who believes the mad person over the respectable employee? There's a hierarchy among attendants too. Senior attendants have better schedules, easier assignments, more authority. Junior attendants, often young women or men in their first positions, get the worst shifts and most difficult wards. Turnover is high because the work is genuinely terrible. Long hours, low pay, constant exposure to disease, risk of injury from violent patients, and the emotional toll of witnessing suffering you can't alleviate. Some attendants last a few months before finding other employment. Others, like Mrs. Pritchard, settle into it, developing the callousness necessary for survival. The nursing staff is slightly higher in the institutional hierarchy, though nurse in Victorian asylums often meant someone with minimal training. These are women who might have completed a basic nursing course or apprenticeship, giving them slightly more medical knowledge than attendants but still far from modern nursing standards. The asylum nurses distribute medications, assist with treatments, monitor patients' physical health, and report to doctors. Some are dedicated professionals genuinely trying to help. Others are simply working-class women who found employment in one of the few fields open to them. Nurse Bradley, who administers your medications, is brusque but competent. She doesn't chat with patients or offer comfort, but she knows her medications and their effects. When you develop a rash from one of the compounds they're giving you, she notices and reports it to the doctor. Her intervention probably saves you from worse toxicity, though she'd never acknowledge doing anything special. To her, your patient number 23, a dosage schedule, a set of symptoms to monitor. Personal connection would make the job impossible. The medical officers, the doctors, occupy the top of the staff hierarchy, though their qualifications vary wildly. The superintendent or medical superintendent runs the entire institution, usually a physician with some psychiatric experience, though experience might just mean he worked in another asylum. Below him are assistant medical officers, younger doctors gaining experience before moving to better positions or private practice. These are the men who examine you, prescribe your treatments, sign your commitment papers, and decide your fate. Dr. Morrison, the superintendent of your asylum, makes rounds twice weekly, sweeping through wards with an entourage of junior doctors and nurses taking notes. He spends perhaps 30 seconds per patient, asking a standard question or two, making notations in files. Still melancholic, I see. He might observe, not really asking, just confirming what's already written. His rounds are performative, demonstrating medical oversight without providing actual medical care. He's managing an institution of 600 patients with 2 assistant doctors. Individual attention is impossible, so patients become categories and symptoms rather than people. Dr. Harrison, one of the assistant medical officers, is younger and occasionally shows flickers of genuine interest in patients as individuals. He's the one who actually examines you when you're ill, who adjusts medication dosages when side effects become severe, who sometimes, rarely, listens when you try to explain how you're feeling. But he's also learning the institutional culture, absorbing the attitudes of his superiors, gradually losing whatever idealism brought him to asylum work. You watch him become more cynical over months, more likely to dismiss patient complaints, more willing to use restraints and harsh treatments. The institutional culture among medical staff is fascinating and horrifying. Doctors publish papers about their patients in medical journals, presenting case studies of interesting pathologies or experimental treatments. You are research material, a source of publishable data, whether you consent or not. Victorian medical ethics didn't require patient consent for publication or even for experimental treatments. If a doctor wants to try a new hydrotherapy regimen or medication combination, he simply orders it and observes the results. You're a test subject in an ongoing experiment you never agreed to participate in. Staff meetings discuss patients in clinical, dehumanizing language. You know this because occasionally patients overhear these discussions or because sympathetic junior staff mention them. You're not the woman who's sad because she was separated from her children. You're chronic melancholic, resistant to treatment, prognosis poor. Your humanity is reduced to symptoms and diagnostic categories. Your suffering transformed into medical problems to be managed rather than human experiences to be understood. The relationship between staff and patients is fundamentally adversarial despite institutional rhetoric about therapeutic care. Staff members maintain order. Patients resist or comply. Staff members have keys and authority. Patients have nothing. Trust is impossible in this dynamic, and without trust, genuine therapeutic relationships can't form. Even the kindest staff member is still an agent of the institution, still capable of ordering restraint or punishment, still separated from you by an unbridgeable power gap. Sexual boundaries between staff and patients were supposed to be absolute, but violations occurred with disturbing frequency. Historians examining Victorian asylum records and scandals have found numerous cases of male attendants or doctors having sexual relationships with female patients, relationships that couldn't possibly be consensual given the power dynamics. These incidents were typically handled quietly, with the staff member dismissed or transferred and the patient blamed for seduction or labeled with erotomania. The institutional structure protected abusers while silencing victims. There's also the curious role of the chaplain, Reverend Thompson, in your asylum. He visits wards weekly, offers spiritual counsel to patients who request it, and conducts Sunday services. He's not medical staff, not quite administrative staff, somewhere in between, providing the moral and spiritual dimension that Victorian asylum philosophy deemed essential. Reverend Thompson is a gentle man who seems genuinely concerned about souls, though his concern doesn't translate into advocacy for better conditions or questioning of treatments. His role is to help patients accept their situation, submit to authority, and find religious meaning in suffering, not to challenge the system causing the suffering. The administrative staff, clerks, accountants, groundskeepers, kitchen workers, form another layer of the institutional hierarchy. These people keep the asylum functioning, processing admissions paperwork, managing budgets, maintaining buildings, preparing food. They interact with patients mainly as labor supervisors or service providers. The clerk who recorded your admission barely looked at you. The cook who oversees kitchen work cares about whether meals are prepared on time, not about whether they're nutritious or palatable. Your operational details, not people. Some staff develop genuine relationships with long-term patients, a kind of institutional familiarity that's not quite friendship but isn't pure antagonism either. Mrs. Pritchard knows Margaret by name now, knows her habits and preferences, occasionally grants small favors like letting her sleep an extra 10 minutes. This isn't kindness exactly, it's just the natural result of years of proximity. But in the asylum's austere environment, even this minimal recognition feels significant. The training of asylum staff, such as it was, emphasized control and order over therapeutic care. New attendants learned restraint techniques, how to manage violent episodes, how to administer forced medications and treatments. They learned the rules and regulations, the daily schedule, the reporting requirements. What they didn't learn was psychology, empathy, therapeutic communication, or any skills that might actually help mentally ill people recover. The asylum was a custodial institution first and therapeutic environment second, and staff training reflected those priorities. Historians still debate how many asylum staff genuinely believed in the treatments they administered versus how many simply followed orders while privately doubting the efficacy of ice baths and restraints. Personal writings from Victorian asylum workers are rare, but when they exist, they often express frustration and moral conflict. Some staff left asylum work traumatized by what they'd witnessed and participated in. Others developed philosophical justifications. The patients are too mad to know what's good for them. Harsh treatments prevent worse outcomes. The system is necessary even if imperfect. The power dynamics between male and female staff mirrored Victorian society's gender hierarchies. Male attendants had authority over female attendants of equal rank. Male doctors had absolute authority over female nurses and attendants. This created situations where female staff were caught between protecting patients and obeying male superiors. A female nurse who objected to a male doctor's harsh treatment risked her employment. A female attendant who reported a male attendant's abuse might be dismissed as hysterical or lying. Staff burnout was a real phenomenon, though Victorians didn't have that term. Attendants who started with good intentions became harsh and punitive after months of thankless work. Nurses became callous after watching patients deteriorate despite care. Doctors became cynical after years of failed treatments and accumulating chronic cases. The asylum broke its staff almost as thoroughly as it broke its patients, creating a culture of mutual suffering where everyone was trapped in a dysfunctional system. The asylum also employed tradespeople and specialists. A pharmacist who compounded the medications, a photographer who documented patients for medical records, sometimes a dentist though dental care was minimal, occasionally visiting specialists in neurology or other fields. These peripheral staff members interacted with patients briefly, if at all, seeing you as specimens or subjects rather than people. The photographer poses you for pictures that will illustrate medical texts or asylum reports, your image used without permission or compensation. Living conditions for staff weren't much better than for patients, at least for lower-level employees. Attendants often lived in small rooms within the asylum complex, their lives consumed by the institution. They ate institutional food only slightly better than patient rations. They worked 12 or 14-hour shifts with minimal time off. The asylum extracted labor from staff and patients alike, grinding both down in service of institutional operations. The relationship you develop with staff is necessarily strategic. You learn who to avoid, who to approach with requests, who might show mercy or who will punish minor infractions. You learn to read Mrs. Pritchard's moods, staying out of her way when she's particularly irritable, asking for favors when she seems relaxed. You learn that Nurse Bradley responds better to specific symptom reports than to emotional complaints. You learn that Dr. Harrison sometimes actually listens if you catch him at the right moment. These aren't relationships, they're survival calculations. The first whisper of rebellion reaches you through Catherine, the former governess who's been here 8 years. She pulls you aside during recreation time, her voice barely audible over the general murmur of the day room. "We're planning something," she says, her eyes darting toward the attendant stationed near the door. "Nothing violent, nothing that will get us all sent to seclusion. But we need you to know there are ways to resist, small ways that add up. This is your introduction to the hidden culture of patient resistance, the underground network of tiny rebellions that make institutional life survivable. The simplest resistance is silence. When doctors ask how you're feeling, you learn to give them nothing useful. The same as yesterday, doctor, you say, revealing no inner thoughts, no vulnerabilities they might exploit, no ammunition for their files. Some patients develop elaborate strategies of selective communication, appearing cooperative enough to avoid punishment while revealing nothing that might extend their stay. You're learning this balance, the art of seeming compliant while protecting your inner self from institutional invasion. There's a smuggling economy you discover gradually. Patients pass forbidden items between wards despite supervision. A pencil stub for writing letters that won't be censored by staff. A small mirror since patients aren't allowed their own. Occasionally food hoarded from meals and shared with those being punished with reduced rations. The exchange happens through complex signals and dead drops. A knotted handkerchief left in a specific location. Items hidden in shared workspaces. Quick handoffs during the chaotic transitions between activities. Margaret teaches you the communication system that operates beneath staff notice. Certain coughs mean warnings when attendants approach. Specific seating arrangements in the day room indicate which patients can be trusted. Songs hummed during work carry messages in their choice and timing. It's an entire language developed over years by people who aren't supposed to communicate unsupervised. A testament to human ingenuity and the desperate need for connection even in oppressive environments. Some resistance is more direct. Thomas, the epileptic man you've seen in the airing courts, deliberately refuses treatments when he can. He's been restrained and force-fed medications dozens of times, but he keeps resisting, maintaining some sense of bodily autonomy even when his resistance guarantees punishment. His defiance inspires others even as it horrifies them with its consequences. After one particularly brutal forced treatment session, he returns to the ward with bruises and a split lip, but also with his dignity somehow intact. There are escape attempts, though rarely successful. The asylum's architecture makes escape nearly impossible. High walls, locked doors, staff supervision, but people try anyway. You hear about a man who made it over the wall last month only to be caught within hours, returned, and sent to seclusion for 2 weeks. Another patient attempted escape during a supervised walk outside the grounds, making it almost a mile before police returned him. Each failed attempt results in tightened security for everyone, but the attempts continue because hope is a powerful motivator even against impossible odds. Letter writing becomes an act of resistance when you realize that official channels are monitored and censored. Patients write letters to family, solicitors, or authorities begging for release or reporting abuse. But these letters pass through the medical superintendent's office where they're read, often withheld, sometimes used as evidence of continued delusion. Patient maintains paranoid beliefs about staff mistreatment. Dr. Morrison writes after reading your letter describing the ice bath treatments. Your attempt to seek help becomes proof you need more help. So some patients develop covert letter writing systems. Catherine has convinced a sympathetic laundry delivery man to smuggle out uncensored letters in exchange for small items she's accumulated. A handkerchief with nice embroidery, a religious medal her family sent. These smuggled letters bypass institutional censorship, reaching the outside world with unfiltered accounts of asylum conditions. Whether they accomplish anything is another question. Victorian society was largely indifferent to asylum conditions, but the act of writing them preserves some sense of agency. Work slowdowns are another resistance tactic. When assigned to institutional labor, patients work just slowly enough to annoy, but not quite slowly enough to warrant punishment. In the laundry, you learn to scrub sheets thoroughly but at a glacial pace, extending a 4-hour task to 6 hours. In the kitchen, patients accidentally ruin food preparation, forcing staff to intervene and slowing overall operations. These tiny sabotages are individually insignificant but collectively frustrate the efficient institutional functioning that depends on patient labor. Some patients resist through deliberate performance of madness. If the institution has labeled you insane, why not use that label strategically? A patient facing unwanted treatments might suddenly become too disturbed to transport safely, buying time. Another might feign symptoms that contraindicate a particular procedure. This is dangerous territory. Performing madness too convincingly can extend your stay or trigger worse interventions, but some patients navigate it skillfully, using the system's own diagnostic assumptions against it. Hunger strikes occasionally occur, though they're brutally suppressed. A patient refusing food might hold out for days, a desperate protest against conditions or treatments. The response is forced feeding. Attendants restraining the patient while a tube is forced down the throat and liquid nutrition poured in. The procedure is agonizing and dangerous, but it prevents the institutional embarrassment of a patient starving to death. You've seen one hunger strike, watched a woman's determination slowly broken by repeated forced feedings until she resumed eating just to avoid the tube. There's also calculated compliance, a form of strategic engagement with the system. Some patients study what behaviors doctors reward: cooperation, religious observance, work productivity, and perform them meticulously while privately maintaining their sense of self. This isn't surrender, it's chess. They're playing a long game toward discharge, giving the institution what it wants to see while protecting their inner autonomy. Historians still argue whether this was resistance or capitulation, but patients who employed these strategies often saw them as survival tactics that preserved something essential. Religious services offer unexpected opportunities for resistance and community. During chapel, patients can sit near each other across gender lines, exchange whispered information while appearing to pray, pass notes inside hymnals. Some patients find genuine spiritual comfort in services, a reminder of life beyond asylum walls. Others use the appearance of religious devotion strategically. Victorian doctors viewed religious faith as evidence of moral improvement and potential recovery, so performing piety could improve your status. The patient hierarchy you learned about earlier also enables resistance. Long-term patients with trustee positions sometimes use their limited authority to help others, warning newcomers about dangerous attendance, smuggling extra food to punished patients, providing information about how the system works. Not all trustees are collaborators. Some are infiltrators using their positions to undermine institutional control from within. Sarah, the teenage girl committed for getting pregnant, has developed her own form of resistance. She tells her story to every new patient. She makes sure everyone knows she's not mad, that she was committed for violating sexual norms, that her diagnosis is social control masquerading as medicine. Her testimony is dangerous. Staff have threatened her with punishment for disturbing other patients. But she persists, creating a counter-narrative to official institutional explanations. Some resistance is purely internal, psychological survival strategies that staff can't detect or prevent. You're developing these yourself. Maintaining private memories of your life before the asylum, rehearsing your real identity in your mind, refusing to internalize the institutional labels applied to you. When Dr. Morrison calls you a chronic melancholic, you silently repeat your real name, your real history, your real self. It's a small thing, but it preserves something essential that the institution tries to erase. There are moments of collective resistance, rare and quickly suppressed but powerful while they last. Once, when a particularly brutal attendant injured a patient during restraint, the entire ward refused to work the next day. They simply sat on their beds, silent and immobile, forcing staff to threaten mass punishment before compliance resumed. The episode lasted only hours, but it demonstrated collective power that terrified authorities. After that, transfers separated the suspected organizers, preventing future coordination. Patients also resist through dark humor, jokes that mock the institution and its pretensions. What's the difference between an asylum patient and an asylum doctor? Someone whispers during work. The doctor has the keys. The laughter is quiet, subversive, a refusal to be completely broken by the system. Humor preserves humanity in inhumane circumstances, reminding patients that they can still think critically about their situation even if they can't escape it. Some patients maintain elaborate fantasy lives, detailed imaginary worlds where they're free, powerful, and valued. Catherine tells you she's written 3 novels in her head, complete narratives she can recite mentally when asylum life becomes unbearable. This isn't delusion. She knows these stories aren't real, but it's psychological resistance, maintaining creativity and imagination in an environment designed to suppress both. There's also strategic use of symptoms. If you know that certain behaviors trigger specific institutional responses, you can manipulate those responses to your advantage. Appearing calm and cooperative gets you better work assignments and more privileges. Occasional displays of distress might get you excused from particularly harsh treatments. Doctors sometimes avoid aggressive interventions with fragile patients. Learning this system takes time, but long-term patients master it, gaining small zones of control within the larger powerlessness. The smuggling of information is another form of resistance. Patients memorize details about institutional abuses, names, dates, specific incidents, planning to testify if they're ever released or if reformers investigate. Some patients have created hidden documents, scratching notes into walls or floorboards, leaving evidence that might survive even if they don't. These hidden testimonies are acts of hope, believing that someday someone will care enough to look, to listen, to expose what happens in these institutions. Not all resistance is noble or effective. Sometimes it's petty. Stealing from other patients, lying to attendants about small things, breaking rules just for the satisfaction of defiance. Sometimes it makes things worse, bringing down punishment on entire wards for individual transgressions. But the impulse to resist, even ineffectively, seems fundamental to human nature. People would rather fight and lose than accept powerlessness without protest. You're learning your own resistance strategies now. You've started hoarding tiny scraps of information about the outside world. Dates mentioned in chapel, news discussed by staff in your hearing, anything that connects you to time and place beyond these walls. You've developed a mental map of the asylum more detailed than staff probably realize, knowing alternate routes and hidden spaces. You've identified which attendants are slightly less vigilant, which times of day offer marginal privacy. These are small tools, but they're yours. The most profound resistance might be simply surviving with your sense of self intact. The asylum wants to transform you into a docile patient, a diagnostic category, a managed problem. Resisting that transformation, maintaining your memories, your relationships, your understanding of yourself as a person rather than a pathology, is an act of defiance. Every day you wake up and remember who you were before this place, you're fighting the institutional goal of erasing that person and replacing her with a compliant inmate. Collective memory serves as resistance too. Older patients tell stories about those who came before, preserving the histories of people the institution tried to forget. Margaret tells you about a woman who was here 5 years ago, brilliant and articulate, who documented asylum conditions in secret writings that were eventually smuggled out and published in a reformist newspaper. The woman was transferred to another institution as punishment, but her testimony survived, her resistance outliving her presence. The reality that settles over you after 6 months in the asylum is perhaps the cruelest. There's no clear path out. You've watched for patterns, for signs of what triggers discharge, for evidence that recovery, real or performed, leads to freedom. What you've discovered instead is that release depends on factors almost entirely beyond your control. A Byzantine system of requirements that shift based on individual doctors' whims, family circumstances, and pure chance. The women who've been here longest have stopped asking when they'll leave because the answer is always the same. Maybe never. The official discharge process requires a medical certificate declaring you recovered, just as admission required certification of insanity. But recovery is subjectively defined by the same doctors whose reputations depend on successful treatments. If you improve, they can claim their interventions worked. If you don't improve, your illness was simply too severe. Either way, they're protected, and you remain trapped in this logical prison where your testimony about your own mental state counts for nothing against their professional opinion. Some patients are released to family members willing to take responsibility for them, but this requires family who want you back. Margaret's husband remarried and shows no interest in her return. Catherine's employer has long since hired another governess and has no reason to reclaim her. Sarah's family disowned her when they institutionalized her. Without someone on the outside advocating for your release, you're dependent entirely on medical staff deciding you're recovered, and they have every incentive to keep beds filled and treatment statistics impressive. The legal frameworks supposedly protecting patients are full of holes. The 1890 Lunacy Act created the commissioners in lunacy who were meant to inspect asylums, review cases, and investigate complaints. But the commissioners are overworked, visiting each asylum perhaps once or twice yearly. Their inspections announced in advance so institutions can prepare. Dr. Morrison ensures the asylum looks its best during commissioner visits. Violent patients are heavily sedated or kept out of sight. Better food is served, staff are on their best behavior. The commissioners see a sanitized version of asylum life and report that conditions are adequate. You learn about the petition system. Theoretically, patients can petition commissioners directly for release or investigation of their cases. But petitions go through the medical superintendent's office, where they're reviewed before forwarding. Dr. Morrison has discretion to determine if a petition demonstrates rational concerns or delusional persecution beliefs. Guess which interpretation prevents your petition from reaching the commissioners. Patients who petition too frequently or too desperately get labeled as having persecutory delusions, their very attempts to seek help becoming evidence of continued madness. Escape remains a fantasy you entertain during the worst moments. You've mentally mapped the wall heights, identified the least supervised areas, noted the schedules of groundskeepers and gatekeepers. But even if you made it over the wall, then what? You have no money, no transportation, no civilian clothes to blend into society. Victorian England had vagrancy laws that allowed police to arrest anyone appearing homeless or disturbed. An escaped asylum patient would be immediately recognizable and quickly returned, facing punishment that would make your current situation seem tolerable. There have been successful escapes, according to asylum legend. A man who worked in the workshops allegedly built a ladder over months from scavenged materials and went over the wall one night. A woman supposedly walked out during a visiting day by pretending to be a visitor leaving. But these stories are unverified, possibly myths that patients tell each other to maintain hope. The reality is that security is tight, supervision constant, and the world beyond the walls is structured to return escaped lunatics to institutional custody. Death is the most common form of discharge. You've witnessed 3 patients die in your 6 months here. One from pneumonia that went untreated until too late, one from what looked like the final stages of tuberculosis, and one elderly woman who simply seemed to give up, refusing food and treatment until her body surrendered. Their bodies were removed quickly and quietly to the asylum morgue, their beds filled with new admissions within days. The institutional machinery doesn't pause for grief or reflection. The mortality rates in Victorian asylums were significantly higher than in the general population. Disease spread easily in crowded, poorly ventilated wards. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Treatments caused complications and sometimes death. Suicide, though officially rare according to asylum records, occurred more often than documented. Staff had incentives to classify suicides as accidents or natural deaths to avoid scandal. Historians examining Victorian asylum data estimate that annual death rates in chronic wards sometimes reached 8 to 10%, meaning a patient admitted at 30 might statistically be dead by 40. You understand now why long-term patients have that hollow look, that absence of hope in their eyes. They've realized what you're beginning to comprehend. This might be forever. The asylum isn't a hospital where you receive treatment and leave cured. It's a warehouse where society stores people it doesn't want to deal with, and once you're stored, retrieval is unlikely. The name asylum originally meant sanctuary or refuge, but it's become a life sentence. Financial considerations trap some patients permanently. If you were a private patient paying for your care, discharge might be easier. Families have incentives to reclaim paying members once they're deemed improved. But pauper lunatics like you cost the parish or government a set weekly rate regardless of how long you stay. There's no financial pressure to discharge you, and keeping you institutionalized is administratively simpler than reintegrating you into society. You're a line item in a budget, a number in the population statistics, not a person waiting to go home. The workhouse system creates another trap. If you were admitted from a workhouse, as many poor patients were, and you're eventually deemed recovered, you'd be discharged back to the workhouse. Victorian workhouses were themselves institutions of punishment and control for the poor, with conditions nearly as bad as asylums. Some patients actually prefer to stay in the asylum rather than return to workhouse life, which tells you everything about how terrible both systems are. There are rare success stories that circulate through the patient network like precious currency. A woman who was here 2 years allegedly convinced a visiting commissioner that she'd been wrongly committed, leading to investigation and discharge. A man supposedly recovered from a genuine mental illness after a year of institutionalization and was released to family. But these stories are rare enough to be remarkable, exceptions that prove the rule. Most people who enter Victorian asylums don't leave except in coffins. The concept of chronic patients, those deemed incurable, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once you're labeled chronic, you're transferred to chronic wards where staffing is minimal, treatments are discontinued, and institutional attention shifts to simple maintenance rather than recovery. The chronic wards are where people go to wait for death, kept alive but not helped, fed but not nourished, housed but not healed. You see patients who've been chronic for 20 years, their entire adult lives consumed by institutionalization. Your own case exemplifies the impossibility of proving recovery. Your original diagnosis, melancholia with hysterical features, was subjective, based on behaviors that could be interpreted multiple ways. How do you prove you're no longer melancholic when sadness is a rational response to imprisonment? How do you demonstrate absence of hysteria when your complaints about harsh treatment are labeled as hysterical overreaction? The diagnostic criteria are unfalsifiable, designed to resist disproof. Some patients attempt strategic performances of recovery, demonstrating cheerfulness, compliance, productivity, religious devotion, all the markers Victorian doctors associated with mental health. But this strategy is dangerous because it can backfire. Too rapid an improvement might be seen as suspicious, possibly indicating you were malingering originally, which could extend your stay as punishment. Too enthusiastic a performance might be interpreted as mania. The window for acceptable recovery behavior is narrow and constantly shifting. The family dynamics outside the asylum complicate discharge prospects. Even if doctors deemed you recovered, would your husband want you back? He's had 6 months to adjust to your absence, 6 months of freedom from whatever behaviors or conflicts led to your commitment. Your household has reorganized around your absence. Your children, if you have them, have adapted. Returning would disrupt this new equilibrium, and families often prefer institutional convenience to domestic complication. Legal incompetency creates another barrier. Once committed, you may have been declared legally incompetent to manage property, sign contracts, or make decisions. This status doesn't automatically reverse upon medical discharge. Someone, usually a male relative, may have been appointed to manage your affairs, and they have little incentive to cede that control back to you. Your property, your money, your legal existence have been transferred to others who benefit from your continued absence. The stigma of asylum commitment follows patients forever, even those eventually discharged. Victorian society viewed mental illness as shameful, a taint on family reputation, possibly hereditary. A woman released from an asylum would struggle to find employment, marriage prospects, or social acceptance. This stigma meant that families sometimes preferred to keep relatives institutionalized indefinitely rather than face social consequences of their return. You're not just fighting for medical discharge, you're fighting against the social death that asylum commitment represents. There's a particularly cruel category of patient, those committed by families who then die or disappear. With no one to discharge you to, no one to assume responsibility, you remain institutionalized indefinitely even if doctors determine you're recovered. The administrative state has no mechanism for releasing mentally ill poor people into society without family support. You'd need housing, employment, means of support, none of which the Victorian system provides for discharged asylum patients. Some patients develop what modern psychology would call institutionalization. They become so adapted to asylum life that freedom becomes terrifying. After years of having every decision made for you, every moment scheduled, every need controlled, the prospect of independent living is overwhelming. You've met patients who were offered discharge but refused it, or who were discharged and quickly returned because they couldn't function outside institutional structure. The asylum creates the very dependency it claims to treat. The asylum's physical structure reinforces the message of permanence. Those high walls aren't temporary, they're built to last centuries. The iron bars on windows aren't provisional, they're permanent installations. The locked doors don't suggest temporary security, they imply perpetual captivity. Everything about the architecture communicates that this is a place people enter but don't leave, a one-way journey from society to institutional oblivion. You've stopped counting the days because the numbers became too depressing. Weeks blend into months, months will blend into years if you're here long enough. The routines that initially seemed unbearable become normalized. Ice baths are just Tuesdays, purgatives are Thursdays, laundry is every day. Your body adapts even as your mind screams against it. This is how institutionalization works. It doesn't convince you that asylum life is good. It just makes you too tired to remember that anything else is possible. The women around you represent your future. Margaret in her 4th year, Catherine in her 8th, an elderly woman in the corner in her 20th. They're your cautionary tales and your roadmap, showing you who you'll become if you can't escape. Their resignation is contagious. Their hopelessness a virus spreading through the ward. You fight it daily, reminding yourself that you're different, you'll get out, someone will advocate for you. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The final cruelty is that some patients genuinely need long-term psychiatric care. People with schizophrenia, severe bipolar disorder, conditions that would benefit from modern treatment, but they receive none. They're imprisoned alongside people who don't need institutionalization at all, everyone receiving the same ineffective or harmful interventions. The Victorian asylum fails both those who shouldn't be there and those who need real help. It's a system that serves no one except the social order that uses it to warehouse inconvenient people. Your cell, because you've stopped pretending it's anything other than a cell, is where you spend your final waking moments each night, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster, wondering if this is how the rest of your life will unfold. The asylum has taken your freedom, your dignity, your identity. It may take your years, your health, your sanity. Real insanity created by the institution claiming to treat it. And there's nothing you can do except survive another day, and another, and another, in the grinding endlessness of Victorian asylum life. Some nights, as the sounds of the wards settle into their familiar symphony of suffering, you allow yourself to imagine escape. Not physical escape, that's too implausible, but some other form of liberation. A reformer exposing asylum conditions, public scandal forcing change, a legal revolution protecting patient rights. It's fantasy, you know. The asylum system will continue decades beyond your lifetime. But the fantasy helps you sleep, helps you face another morning bell, another day of captivity. And sleep, finally, is the only escape guaranteed to everyone here. The lights have been out for hours now. Your breathing has slowed, synchronized with the rhythms of the ward around you. The sounds that once terrified you, the moans, the whispers, the creaking of bed frames, have become a lullaby of sorts. Not comforting exactly, but familiar. In the asylum, familiarity is the closest thing to peace you're going to find. Tomorrow will be the same as today, and the day after that, and the day after that. The routine will continue, the treatments will persist, the walls will remain standing. You've learned that survival doesn't mean escape. It means endurance. It means protecting some small part of yourself from institutional erosion, maintaining a spark of identity beneath the diagnostic labels and patient numbers. As you drift toward sleep, your mind wanders to the world beyond these walls. Somewhere, people are living free lives, making choices, experiencing joy, planning futures. That world continues without you, indifferent to your captivity, unbothered by your suffering. But knowing it exists gives you something to hold on to, a reminder that reality extends beyond this institution even if you can't reach it. The asylum wants you to forget who you were before, It wants you to accept your diagnosis, internalize your patient role, surrender your former identity. Resisting that erasure, even in small ways, becomes the meaning you construct from meaninglessness. You are not just patient number 23, chronic melancholic, institutional case study. You are still yourself, somewhere beneath the labels, waiting for a dawn that may never come. But sleep comes instead, merciful and temporary, offering a few hours of escape that no wall can prevent. In dreams, you're free. In dreams, the locks don't exist. And that will have to be enough for now. Sweet dreams.